I still remember that morning as if it's carved into my bones. The air inside the hospital was cold, but my heart was racing so fast it felt like I was carrying the sun inside me. I was about to meet my babies, my beautiful twins. I had dreamed about this moment for months, through every kick, every sleepless night, every soft whisper of lullabies I practiced under my breath. My husband, Daniel, was pacing near the bed. He kept glancing at the clock, smiling nervously, rubbing his hands as if he was preparing for the most important interview of his life. In truth, it was bigger than any job, bigger than any dream we had ever shared. We were about to become parents. We had painted the nursery in soft yellow, because we didn't want to know the genders ahead of time. We wanted it to be a surprise. 2 little cribs stood side by side, waiting at home, with tiny stuffed animals and blankets my grandmother had knitted. Daniel had even stuck a piece of paper on the door that said the Twins' Kingdom. That's how much we were waiting for them. That's how much love we had already poured into these children who hadn't even opened their eyes yet. I told myself over and over, this will be the happiest day of my life. When the contractions started, I cried, not from pain, but from joy. My babies were coming. I imagined holding them against my chest, feeling their tiny fingers curl around mine. I imagined Daniel crying the way he promised he would, saying, "You did it, we're a family now." And then, the doors opened. I thought maybe it was another nurse, or a doctor. Instead, 2 strangers walked in. They weren't dressed in scrubs. Their faces were stiff, their voices colder than the air. They introduced themselves as officials from Barnevernet, Norway's child welfare service. At first, I didn't understand. Why were they here? Why now, of all moments? One of them stood close to my bed and said in a tone that pierced through my joy like a knife, "We are here to take custody of the children. They will not be going home with you." I laughed. I actually laughed, because I thought it had to be a mistake. A terrible, absurd mistake. I had just given birth, I hadn't even held them yet. I was drenched in sweat, my body trembling from labor, my heart wide open for the first cries of my children, and these strangers were talking about custody. I turned to Daniel, waiting for him to say something, waiting for him to stop them. His face was pale, frozen in disbelief. And then the nurse carried the first baby past me. I stretched my arms, desperate, whispering, "Give me my child, please, just for one moment." But the official blocked me. With a straight face, he shook his head. They didn't even let me hold them. Do you know what it feels like to have your heart ripped out of your chest while you're still alive? That's what it felt like. My body screamed for my babies, my arms ached, my breasts ached, my soul screamed louder than any words I could form. But all I could do was watch as my newborns were carried past me, as if I were invisible, as if I were nothing more than a vessel that had served its purpose. Daniel tried to argue, his voice shaking. Why? What reason? We're their parents. The officials muttered something about documents, about concerns from years ago, about reports that had nothing to do with the mother I had become. They talked about me as if I wasn't even in the room, as if I couldn't hear. I kept repeating, "Let me hold them. Just once. Please, please, I beg you." No one listened. The sound of their tiny cries filled the hallway as they were taken away. That was the first and last time I heard my babies that day. I collapsed on the bed, shaking uncontrollably. Tears blurred everything. I don't remember how long I screamed, or what I said. I only remember the emptiness, the unbearable silence in my arms, the way my chest heaved for children who weren't there. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became the darkest. As the hours dragged on, the room that should have been filled with joy and balloons and congratulations was instead filled with silence. Daniel sat beside me, his head buried in his hands. Every so often, he whispered, "We'll fight this. We'll bring them home. They're ours." But in that moment, it didn't feel real. It felt like I was trapped in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I kept replaying the moment in my head, their tiny bodies wrapped in white blankets, their cries piercing the air, my hand reaching out and never touching them. A mother's first instinct is to hold her child. To comfort. To protect. To whisper, "I'm here, you're safe." But I wasn't allowed that. Instead, my babies were placed into the hands of strangers, while I lay broken on a hospital bed, my arms empty. That night, I whispered into the darkness, over and over, "I will not let this be the end. They are mine. I will fight for them." And that was the moment my war began, not against another person, but against a system that decided my children were better off without me. I didn't know how, or when, or what it would take. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I would not stop until my babies were back in my arms. I never imagined the past could follow me like a shadow, waiting for the moment I felt safest to strike. But it did. Years ago, long before I even thought about becoming a mother, someone close to me had spread lies. It was a bitter family dispute. My aunt, jealous and angry over a small inheritance, once claimed I was unfit to manage even myself, let alone a family. She made wild accusations, said I couldn't be trusted, that I had problems. It was nonsense, of course. Even back then, it never led to anything serious. Authorities had looked into it briefly and closed the file. I was a teenager then, too young to defend myself the way I can now. And like most painful memories, I buried it and moved on. Or so I thought. What I didn't know was that file, those false words, still sat somewhere in a cabinet, gathering dust but never erased. And now, all these years later, as I was preparing to cradle my newborn twins for the first time, that file was pulled out and laid on a desk by people who had never met me. I kept asking myself, how could something so old, something proven false, be used against me? I was living a quiet, steady life. My husband and I had worked so hard to build our home. We prepared every detail for our babies, the nursery painted in soft pastels, a little crib my husband sanded and polished with his own hands, the closet full of tiny clothes we'd folded and refold, smiling at each pair of socks. I cooked healthy meals, went to my appointments, did everything a doctor advised. I wasn't reckless. I wasn't careless. I was ready. But in the eyes of the people who stormed into that hospital room, none of that mattered. They had already judged me. The papers they carried weren't just words, they were sentences. Prison bars on a page. Chains disguised as child protection. And those old lies, those twisted claims that were never proven, were now painted as evidence. I sat there on the hospital bed, weak from delivery, my body aching, my heart swelling with a love that was never allowed to bloom. They stood over me and said I wasn't capable, that I was a risk. A risk. That word burned. I wanted to scream, I am their mother. How can I be a risk to the very children I grew inside me? But my voice cracked. My throat felt strangled by invisible hands. I tried to explain, tried to tell them I had never harmed anyone, never even raised my voice in anger. I told them about my work, about the quiet mornings with my husband where we planned the children's future. I told them about the stacks of books I had read about parenting, about the prenatal classes we attended faithfully. I wanted them to know that I was prepared, that I had done everything right. But their eyes were cold. They weren't listening to me. They were listening to the file. How could something from my past, something I didn't even do, be enough to steal my babies? That question spun inside my mind like a storm. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their tiny faces, the ones I was barely allowed to glimpse, floating further and further away from me, pulled by the tide of paperwork and judgments made by strangers. I thought about the years I had spent rebuilding my life. I wasn't a reckless girl anymore. I was a woman, a wife, now a mother. I thought about all the nights I lay awake, dreaming of rocking my children to sleep, whispering to them that they were safe in my arms. And now, because of one person's lies from long ago, those dreams were stolen before they could even begin. It felt like being punished for a crime I didn't commit. A crime that never existed. I remember gripping the edge of the hospital sheet so hard my knuckles went white. My husband's hand rested on my shoulder, trembling as much as mine. He whispered, "We'll fight this. They can't do this." But the truth was, they already had. The women in suits, the men with clipboards, they didn't see us as a family. They saw us as a case number. A problem to be managed. A headline waiting to be avoided. In that moment, my whole world collapsed, not because of what I had done, but because of what someone once said I might do. And that's when the real horror sank in. This wasn't about who I was. It was about who they decided I was. And no matter how many tears I shed, no matter how many words I spoke, my past, those dusty lies from a bitter relative, had risen from the grave to haunt me. To take from me the only thing I had ever wanted in this life, my children. The weeks that followed felt like living in a nightmare I couldn't wake from. My body was still healing from giving birth, but my mind was consumed with one thought: I have to get my babies back. Instead of holding my newborn twins against my chest, I was holding documents, reading summons, filling out forms. The hospital bed was replaced by court benches, the quiet hum of lullabies replaced by the sharp echo of gavels and the flat voices of people who barely said my name right. It began with evaluations. Endless evaluations. They wanted to know if I was fit. Fit to love. Fit to raise. Fit to simply exist as a mother. I was sent to psychologists who asked me questions about my childhood, about my temper, about things that felt so irrelevant it made me want to scream. How does asking me whether I cried as a child prove if I can change a diaper? How does asking about arguments with a long-dead relative prove if I can feed my babies? But I answered everything. I sat in those cold rooms, hands folded tight, and told myself every answer brings me closer to them. The nights were the worst. My husband tried to stay strong for me, but I could hear him crying in the bathroom when he thought I was asleep. I cried too, into the pillow, into the silence, into the empty space where 2 cribs waited untouched. The milk my body made for them went to waste. I would sit on the edge of the bed, aching, as if my own body betrayed me by producing what my babies were denied. We were treated like criminals. As if we had hurt our children, when the truth was we never even got the chance to hold them properly. Every letter from the authorities read like an accusation. Every meeting felt like a trial. But we kept fighting. We found a lawyer who believed us. A kind woman with tired eyes who had seen too many families torn apart. She told us it wouldn't be easy, but she would fight with us. She guided us through the maze of hearings, taught us how to speak when the officials tried to twist our words, and reminded us, over and over, that truth mattered even if it took time. The hearings stretched on. Sometimes I would sit for hours in the courtroom, listening as strangers debated my ability to be a mother, as if I wasn't sitting right there. I wanted to stand up and shout, "Look at me. I am already their mother." But my lawyer's hand on mine reminded me to stay calm, to let the evidence speak. Finally, after months of tests, reports, and interviews, the results began to turn in our favor. The psychologist said I showed no signs of being unfit. The home inspections showed a safe, warm environment ready for children. Every piece of proof stacked up on our side. It was a small victory, one that should have been obvious from the start. And yet, the twins did not come home. They remained in foster care. Two tiny souls who didn't know why their mother and father weren't with them, why strangers tucked them into bed. We were allowed visits. 2 hours at a time. Always under watch. The first time I held them, months after giving birth, I thought my heart would break from both joy and pain. They were heavier now, their little faces fuller. My son clung to my shirt, burying his face in my chest. My daughter reached for my hair, her tiny fist curling around it like she was holding on for dear life. And when the visit ended, when the social worker said it was time to go, they cried. They cried so hard it felt like the walls of that room would collapse from the sound. My arms reached for them, but the worker pulled them away. My son's scream still echoes in my ears, desperate, confused, betrayed. Every visit after was the same. 2 hours of fleeting happiness, followed by the agony of separation. Every time I walked into that room, I prayed they wouldn't remember the last goodbye. Every time I walked out, I feared the pain was carving scars into their tiny hearts. How do you explain to a baby that their mother is fighting for them in rooms filled with papers and laws? How do you tell a toddler that the reason they can't come home is because someone decided to believe a lie from years ago? I kissed their hands, their foreheads, whispered into their ears that I loved them, that I would never stop fighting. And I meant it. Because being a mother isn't about what a file says. It isn't about what a courtroom decides. It's about refusing to give up, even when the system crushes you, even when nights blur into days of tears and despair. Every report that proved I was not unfit felt like a brick laid on the road back to them. But that road was still so long, so cruel. And every time those 2 hours ended with my children crying in the arms of strangers, I swore to myself. One day, I will not say goodbye. One day, they will come home. When the hearings dragged on and the weeks turned into months, I found myself sitting in waiting rooms more often than in my own home. At first, I kept to myself, holding my papers tightly, staring at the floor, hoping no one would notice my tears. But over time, the faces around me began to look familiar, mothers, fathers, even grandparents, all waiting for the same thing, a chance to be heard. And that's when I realized something I hadn't dared to believe before, I wasn't the only one. One mother leaned toward me one day, her voice barely above a whisper. She told me her children had been taken because her house was not tidy enough. She said she was working 2 jobs, doing her best, and sometimes the dishes piled up in the sink. That was all it took for someone to say she was unfit. Another father, with tired eyes and a folder full of documents, told me his son was removed because he struggled in school. The welfare worker claimed he wasn't providing enough support, though the boy simply needed a little extra help with reading. Instead of offering tutoring or guidance, they took him away. Then there was the young couple from abroad. They told me through tears that their daughter was removed because they fed her with their hands. In their culture, that was a sign of care, of love. But to the system here, it became a red flag, something unacceptable. The mother kept repeating, how could they not understand? This is how I was raised, how my mother fed me. Every story echoed my own in some way, different details, but the same cruel pattern. It was as if the child welfare system wasn't designed to help families, but to break them apart for the smallest reasons. It felt like the system wasn't protecting children, it was tearing families apart. The more stories I heard, the heavier the weight on my chest became. I began to question everything I thought I knew. When I was little, I believed that authorities stepped in only when children were truly unsafe, hungry, beaten, abandoned. But sitting there, listening to one devastated parent after another, I realized that wasn't always the case. Here, a cluttered living room could be called neglect. A child's shyness at school could be labeled emotional harm. A cultural difference could be twisted into risk. I remember walking home after one of those meetings, the cold air biting my face, my hands trembling as I pulled my coat tighter. And in that moment, one thought lodged itself deep in my mind, refusing to let go. If they can take my children over nothing, who's next? Was it the single mother I passed at the grocery store, juggling groceries and a toddler on her hip? Was it the couple I saw in the park, letting their little boy run barefoot in the grass? Was it the father who raised his voice in frustration when his daughter wouldn't listen? I looked at the world differently after that. Every family I saw, every parent I met, I couldn't help but wonder if they knew how fragile it all was. How a single visit, a single judgment, could tear their lives apart the way mine had been torn. The fear followed me everywhere. A knock on the door made my heart leap. A letter in the mailbox made my hands shake. Even laughter, the sound of children playing in the distance, hurt, because it reminded me of what I was missing. But alongside that fear grew something else, a deep, aching sadness for the others who were still trapped in this nightmare. Parents who might never get their children back, whose names would never make headlines, whose tears would never be seen. I wasn't alone. I knew that now. But the truth was, none of us should have been there in the first place. And as I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, one question haunted me over and over again: if they can do this to me, if they can do this to us, then who will they come for next? The days had blurred together into months. Courtrooms, hearings, evaluations, my life had become a cycle of waiting and weeping, of proving and being doubted, of hope rising and falling again. I had almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without fear. And then, it happened. I still remember the moment my lawyer called. Her voice trembled as she said, "They've decided. You're getting your babies back." I didn't know whether to scream, to cry, or to collapse on the floor. For so long, I had braced myself for more heartbreak, for another excuse, another delay. I had trained my heart not to hope too much. But in that instant, all the walls I built around myself crumbled. I fell to my knees, clutching the phone, whispering through tears, "Thank you, God. Thank you." The hours between that call and the reunion felt like the longest of my life. My husband held my hand as we drove, both of us silent, both afraid to even breathe too deeply, as if this miracle could vanish if we moved wrong. I kept staring out the window, imagining their faces, wondering if they would recognize me, if they would remember my scent, my voice, my heartbeat. When we arrived, my legs shook so badly I thought I might not make it up the steps. And then, the door opened. There they were. My babies. I can't describe what it feels like to see your children after being torn apart for so long. It was like the whole world had stopped spinning, just for us. They were smaller than I remembered, their eyes wide, almost unsure. But then came the moment I will never forget. They ran to me. Tiny arms wrapped around my neck, tiny fingers clutching me as if they were afraid I might disappear again. I sobbed so hard I could barely see them, but I kissed their hair, their cheeks, their hands, over and over. "Mama's here. Mama's here. I'll never let you go again." My husband was beside me, holding them too, his tears falling silently down his face. For months, he had been my rock, the one who kept me from collapsing completely. But that day, I saw him break, and I knew this wasn't just my victory. It was ours. The officials in the room stood awkwardly, watching, but in that moment, they faded into nothing. All that existed was the sound of my babies breathing against me, the weight of them in my arms. I thought of every night I had spent crying into my pillow, every supervised visit where I was forced to hand them back after 2 hours, every court session where strangers debated whether I was fit to be their mother. None of it mattered now. What mattered was this, holding them, feeling their warmth, knowing that they were mine again. The road ahead wasn't easy. Even after they came home, I lived with the fear that someone might knock on the door and take them again. But slowly, day by day, life returned. I cooked their meals. I tucked them into bed. I heard them laugh in the mornings. And each sound, each smile, was a reminder I had won them back. I also knew I would never be the same. That kind of pain changes you. It carves scars deep into your soul. But it also gives you a fire to fight, not just for yourself, but for others. Because I had seen the truth. I had seen families ripped apart for reasons that never should have been enough. I had seen mothers weeping in waiting rooms, fathers clutching empty hands. And though my story ended with reunion, not everyone's does. I wish I could tell you that justice always wins, that love always triumphs. But I can't. What I can tell you is this: sometimes, miracles do happen. And the day I held my babies again was my miracle. Even now, when I watch them sleep, I press my hand gently against their backs, just to feel them breathing. Because I know how close I came to losing them forever. And maybe that's why I'll never take another moment for granted. Every hug, every laugh, every step they take, these are treasures I will hold on to with everything I am. I was broken, yes. But in the end, I was also rebuilt, stronger, fiercer, and forever bound to the two little souls who gave me the strength to fight. That day that should have been the happiest, the day they were born, was stolen from me. But the day I held them again? That was the day my life truly began. Barnevernet isn't protecting families, it's breaking them apart. Stories like mine are not isolated, they are happening to parents across Norway and beyond. If you believe families deserve to stay together, then help spread this message. Like this video, share it so more people know the truth, and subscribe so these voices don't get silenced. Every click is one step closer to exposing a system that's hurting children instead of protecting them.